Well, good afternoon. I am so honored to join you today at the Mosaic Center, an institution that celebrates two things near and dear to me: civil rights and African American culture, in a city that is home to critical events in the civil rights movement. I come to you today as an activist, a cook, a teacher, and perhaps most importantly, seeing as it's my book that brought me here, as a writer. So if it's all right with you, I would like to start our conversation by sharing with you one of my favorite pieces of writing, a poem by Patricia Smith. When the Burning Begins, for Otis Douglas Smith, my father. The recipe for hot water cornbread is simple. Cornmeal, hot water. Mix till sluggish, then dollop in a sizzling skillet. When you smell the burning begin, flip it. When you smell the burning begin again, dump it onto a plate. You've got to wait for the burning and get it just right. Before the bread cools down, smear it with sweet salted butter and smash it with your fingers. Crumple it up in a bowl of collard greens or buttermilk. Forget that I'm telling you it's the first thing I ever cooked, that my daddy was laughing and breathing and no bullet in his head when he taught me. Mix it till it looks like quicksand, he'd say, till it moves like a slow song sounds. We'd sit there in the kitchen, licking our fingers and laughing at my mother, who was probably scrubbing something with bleach or watching Bonanza, or thinking how stupid it is to be burning that nasty old bread in that cast iron skillet. When I told her that I made my first ever pan of hot water cornbread and that my daddy had branded it glorious, she sniffed and kept mopping the floor over and over in the same place. So here's how you do it. You take out a bowl, like the one we had with blue flowers and only one crack. You put the cornmeal in it. Then you turn on the hot water and you let it run while you tell a story about the boy who kissed your cheek after school, or about how you really want to be a reporter instead of a teacher or nurse like Mama said. And the water keeps running while Daddy says you will be a wonderful writer. And you will be famous someday, and when you get famous, if I wrote you a letter and sent you some money, would you write about me? And he was laughing and breathing and no bullet in his head, so he let the water run into this mix till it moves like mud moves at the bottom of a river, which is another thing Daddy said, and even though I'd never even seen a river, I knew exactly what he meant. Then you turn the fire way up under the skillet, and you pour in this mix that moves like mud moves at the bottom of a river, like quicksand, like a slow song sounds. That stuff pops something awful when it first hits that blazing skillet, and sometimes Daddy and I would dance to those angry pop sounds. He'd let me rest my feet on top of his while we waltzed around the kitchen, and my mother huffed and puffed on the other side of the door. When you are famous, Daddy asked me, will you write about dancing in the kitchen with your father? I say everything I write will be about you, then you will be famous too. And we dip and swirl and spin, but then he stops and sniffs the air. The thing you have to remember about hot water cornbread is to wait for the burning so you know when to flip it, and then again so you know when it's crusty and done. Then eat it the way we did, with our fingers, our feet still tingling from the dancing. But remember that sometimes the burning takes such a long time, and in that time, poems are born. Clap for Patricia, not for me. When I think about the definition of food, any nutritious substance that people or animals eat or drink in order to maintain life and growth, nourishment, provisions, When I think of things that I eat and drink in order to keep me alive, the idea of food takes on a whole heap of meaning. I drink sunlight. I devour books. Music gives me life. My soul needs nourishment. A cook and a poet have a lot in common. A recipe and a poem have a lot in common. A meal and a book do a lot of the same good work. One works on the body, one works on the soul. Sometimes a book reads so right it soothes real aches, physical pain, the hunger in your belly. Sometimes food tastes so good it changes your spirit, mends your broken heart, connects you to a past you feared you might forget. I am a poet, and I am a home cook. I do not know how to be one without the other. I have to be both. Henri Bontemps was a Harlem Renaissance writer. He also happened to be my great-grandfather, though I never had the opportunity to know him. His daughter, my Nana, Joan, was a librarian who collected cookbooks. And it was Joan, not Arna, who taught me that words and food, writing and feeding people, they don't just go together, they belong together. My Nana passed away in 1998. In life, she was the financial backbone of her family. Her husband, A. Ronald Williams Jr., was a civil rights lawyer who was paid little when he was working hardest. She cooked for leaders of the civil rights movement when they came through Nashville. She cooked for big groups. She made stews and pâtés and pies. She left me a beautifully curated cookbook collection of nearly 2,000 cookbooks. She didn't mind that she didn't eat well. Healthily, I should say. She ate well. Cooking from and with books let Nana free herself from daily kitchen drudgery, so common to Black women in the 1950s and 60s. She brought work home in the best way. She made cooking an academic exercise, a form of scholarship that brought joy and good times, she was a Bontemps, after all, to herself and her family. She created a new kitchen, located squarely in Dixie. Nashville is the buckle of the Bible Belt, that exploded old parameters and freed her from the southern roots of her kitchen. Her own mother was conceived in a kitchen involuntarily. And so that's just a hard truth of Black women in kitchens in this part of the world. The cookbook collection let her connect with cooks from wherever she liked, from France, from England, from China, Japan, and Mexico, making cooking the reprieve and recreation that, for so many Black women, it could never be, because it was work they did in other women's homes, for other people's families. Cooking from a book was refined. It was a respite. It was a rapprochement. When Nana worked in the kitchen, it was work of her mind, tended toward the scholarship of the books she'd chosen, rather than the unsung, much harder story of many a Black woman cook before and after her. She defined her kitchen not by the dishes she cooked, but by the pages she owned, the pages she read. Collecting her cookbooks allowed Nana to hide her identity as a librarian in plain sight, so that her husband could be the star. The presence of the books, which were scattered throughout the house, might have been invisible to most visitors, but Nana always felt their presence keenly. She knew where each volume was and what its placement meant. And I have to believe in their significance to her as a legacy, as a treasured family fortune or commodity, because they are what she left me. And when she left me those books, she wasn't teaching me how to cook. She was teaching me how to read with passion and feed myself by her own example. Title by title, recipe by recipe, dish by dish, cooking from the can opener cookbook, the peasant kitchen, from Palm Beach Entertains to the Jewish Japanese sex and cookbook, From dinner at Buckingham Palace to spoonbread and strawberry wine, Nana wandered the world and defeated stereotypes used to define and confine the black woman's kitchen. Food fixed by black women wasn't just something to be learned experientially, something handed down mother to daughter, which is a precious practice, but a cook to cook's daughter. It could be a mentally demanding, academically engaging, routine-defying luxury. In my first published poetry collection, I wrote to honor Nana and these truths she shared with me. Allow me, if you will, to share that now with all of you. Let me tell you in a poem just a little bit more about my Nana. Backbone. Nana would say, "Come here, child, what kind of comb does your mother use?" And then I would sit between her legs where the bluish, flowery dressing gown spread over the reddish, flowery wingback, howl as she dragged that paddle brush through my naps and rounds. Hush, girl. I would grimace and spit and let tears itch up the corners of my eyes. Stand still, though, as she smoothed my scalp with the sweat off her highball. Glenlivet, 11 a.m., every day, come breast or bone, brain or wing, and wove the tufts into a fluffy braid half down my back. Cancer, hell. She'd turn on the Vivaldi, pat her chemo bag, teach me spades. Aunt Wendy curled her hair for late church, and Daddy looked on long-faced at us all. I would reach for a card and, ashy, turn around and let me get some of this on you. The Vaseline was always in a jar next to the lamp, behind the whiskey and the remote control. It looks like you've been crawling around in flour on your knees and elbows. Nana made those joint bones glisten, she did. Died. And my cousin, out loud, she wrote a menu, said, "I know how to make cheesecake, I know how to make shrimp, I can fix corn pone, potatoes." But me, I knew in secret how to make a shiny elbow out of flour and Vaseline, how to make a rope hang from my head with screams and Scotch sweat. I'm proud of my family. I'm proud of being from the South, the corn pone, hot water cornbread, corn-fed South. I am a Southern girl. Georgia and Alabama and Louisiana are in my blood. Nashville is my hometown. The Mississippi Delta showed me who I wanted to be as a woman. And as Southern women, we're supposed to be able to cook. And by cook, I don't mean follow a tidy recipe or warm something up. I mean feed your family and friends in mind and body with things that are delicious and not give two hoots about how healthy they are. Except that when you love your family, you want them to live. And live well. And while I don't have enough fingers and toes to count the number of people in my family who have gotten fat and sick from what modern memory remembers as soul food. I taught high school English on a dirt road in Louisville, Mississippi for 2 years. I brought my lunch almost every day. Roasted chicken, baked fish, plain sweet potatoes, and you know what my students used to say to me? "Miss Williams, you eat like a white girl." And you know what I used to say to them? "Nope, I eat like an old black lady." Those things I was eating, that I still eat, those are old school soul. I have a friend I used to teach with called Ruthie Collins. When I told Ruthie I was writing a healthy soul food cookbook, she looked at me real funny at first, and then she thought a bit more. And then she shared with me a conversation she had with her mother-in-law. Her sharing that conversation changed some things for me, and I hope it can change some things for y'all too. Ruthie, all 300 pounds of her, told me she used to bake a pound cake once a week and that her mother-in-law called her out, said that when she was young, they had a pound cake at holidays, yes, but not every week. That was too much. It made the cake less special. That's when I got woke. We've begun to mistake celebration food for everyday food. Now, this weekend is a celebration weekend. I love cornbread, and I'm not even a purist. I like it so thick it's like cake, or crispy from a skillet, with sugar or without, with buttermilk or molasses or sorghum or greens and beans. The way we eat cornbread, with what and with whom and when and how, those memories and rituals tell our stories, and I love that. But I am here in this space on this day to tell some hard truths too. When corn found its way to Africa, it helped fuel the slave trade. People were ripped from their families while they worked in cornfields. Corn mesh sustained the Middle Passage. Cornbread made it possible to work from can't see in the morning to can't see at night, at no great expense to whomever it was that thought they owned you. When we come to a soul food table, we are eating our history. We are eating historically, and we must remember. When I wrote the recipes for my cookbook, I wasn't just putting health and history on a plate. I was writing in those recipes love letters to grandmothers and grandfathers, to Black women and men who worked to create powerful meals that sustained families. Creating a celebration mood without unhealthy celebration food is a forgotten Black American tradition. For me, words, music, company, poetry, those things feed me in many ways as significantly as food itself does. I want you all to take a moment as I speak to think about the things that feed you. Think back to Patricia Smith's poem. It's a recipe for so many things. Not just hot water cornbread, cornmeal, hot water, mixed till sluggish, dollop in a sizzling skillet. That's pretty straightforward, right? But what about this? Take out a bowl like the one we had with blue flowers and only one crack. You put the cornmeal in it. Then you turn on the hot water and you let it run while you tell the story about the boy who kissed your cheek after school, or about how you really want to be a reporter instead of a teacher or nurse like Mama said. What are the ingredients to Patricia Smith's hot water cornbread? Her father's voice, the knowledge of how a slow song sounds, how mud moves at the bottom of a river, her mother's bleach, bonanza on the TV. Doesn't it seem like the emotional, intangible ingredients are as important as the physical ingredients that go into the batter, into the pan? I love the idea of the word fix. I'm going to fix some cornbread. I'm fixing to eat. I love the way we use it here in the South and how it's not used anywhere else. Whose family uses the word to fix instead of to cook? Just to take a quick survey. I'm going to fix dinner, not cook it, right? I love that because there are so many things that you can fix, and there are so many ways to fix something, right? This idea of repair, of sustaining, of enduring. It shows how layered the act of cooking can be to fix. Recipes tell stories. They keep family histories. When my grandmother passed away, she left me her 2000 cookbook collection, but as a grown woman, I've come to know her through her cookbooks. Seeing the recipes she saved, the notes she took, the flowers pressed into the pages. When I fix salmon croquettes, it's not just the fish and the onion and the egg and the celery that goes in. It's me remembering her with her book, her finger pointing out each item for the recipe, her highball glass of scotch, pushing my fluffy braid out of the way in the kitchen. Think about your family recipes, what the actual ingredients are. Write them down. Put things in your books for your family to find. What are the real secret ingredients, the ones that you taste with your soul instead of your mouth? I've been thinking a lot lately about the future of food. And when I think about what the future of food looks like, I find myself thinking back to that conversation with my friend Ruthie. I think and hope that the future looks like the past of Ruthie's mother-in-law, more than it looks like the past of my grandmother with her pâtés and her pig's feet and her scotch. Ruthie's mother-in-law knew that excess every day would spoil the real pleasures of a meaningful feast. And I know that now too. The foods we now think of as soul food are not the ones families were eating day in and day out. They are the celebration foods that have claimed our attention over time. All that extra sugar, the flour, the cream, those things were luxuries. The food at the soul of our Southern community, the food that kept us on our feet and marching forward, was often clean and delicious. For now, standing on the shoulders of these women and this beautiful tradition of our Southern food, I'm going to fight for my good health and a gracious table. I'm going to make do and make plenty. And I'm going to make it as good for the body as it is for the soul. I will write and cook from my history, from our history, our past, our present, and from the fresh start of what I hope the future looks like. These days, Nana's cookbook collection is in my home in Nashville, where I am working to make a life out of food and books, collecting them, studying them, creating them. And somehow, by the grace of God, the ghost of Nana, and the gift of my mother's unflagging energy, I've gotten the opportunity to write a cookbook of my own. One that fights for the gift of good health that I am determined to hunt, and it's a full circle I never saw coming. Thank you. Am I meant to open it up to questions? Is that so? Does anyone have any questions, thoughts, comments, stories to share? It's been amazing. I get to hear people.
Hello. Hi, my name is Vanita Franklin, and I'm an economics major at UALR. And I just want to say thank you so much for sharing your story. And my grandmother just passed away on August the 13th. She was 100 years old. And I'm kind of tearful right now because your story is exactly hers, because she was just that type of woman. Her life was about cooking, and I, too, have all of her recipes. So thank you again.
I'm so glad.
Hi, I'm Pat Rogers Ward, and I do love to cook soul food. And we are coming into the Thanksgiving season, and one of my favorite recipes that everybody likes is my cornbread dressing. So I want to know, what is your favorite stuffing or dressing recipe? We call it dressing. Some people call it stuffing.
Dressing. It's dressing, stuffing.
So that's what I would like to know.
What is my favorite dressing recipe? Golly. We make one with cornbread and sausage and sage. My great-grandmother kept a garden, and I really love that with the crumbly sausage. But I also, my mother spent some time in New England and brought back an oyster dressing that's pretty wonderful too. But they're not healthy. But it is a celebration, so that's okay. Now I can cook the other stuff too, and I love to. So I look forward to those celebration meals to fix. I really do. Any other questions?
My name is Faith Anaya, and I teach kids to cook. and I just want to thank you for the inspiration that you've given me today to think even more about the stories that we create with our food.
Absolutely. And getting kids in the kitchen early, food literacy is so critical. I think sometimes children get on their foot and so they get shooed out, but I think that part of being healthy is feeling comfortable in the kitchen, so then you feel empowered to have adventures in there from a young age. That's amazing. Thank you for doing that.
Hi, can you give us an example of how you've taken a traditional soul food recipe and made it healthier?
Absolutely. Although I will say it's interesting. We talk about, in the cookbook, we do a little bit of remixing, which is what you're asking about. And then also, I'm interested in reviving as well. You know, this morning on Good Morning Arkansas, I had the opportunity to make salmon croquettes, which can actually be a quite healthy dish. You know, if you don't deep fry it in bacon grease and cover it in breadcrumbs first. But a salmon croquette at its heart is not an unhealthy thing to eat. And that is a classic old school Southern thing. And my grandfather used to love to eat baked red snapper. That was his favorite meal. You know, so it's delicious. He was in Alabama. He grew up in Alabama. He loved baked red snapper. And another really clean, classic Southern meal. But I do have things like a healthy breakfast casserole that calls for egg whites and ground turkey that's really delicious. And you know, spices, your spice rack can become your best friend. And it's where I put a lot of my financial investment in my kitchen rather than on cuts of meat. I'm more interested in the flavor that spices can bring, which I think gets back to our my North African roots as well. You know, that's really exciting culinary practice that I've been exploring. But so I have a healthy breakfast casserole. I have sort of an answer to sweet potatoes that is a roasted sweet potatoes with pomegranates and spicy pepper sauce that I really love. And I usually serve that where I would otherwise have served some sort of candied yams or something. And then a mess of collard greens that I do with tomatoes and a lot of heat instead of with a leg of a pig inside. Which is, again, that's sort of West Indian roots, right? There's so many, the diaspora is so wide-reaching, and so thinking back to kinds of blackness and spaces where our food comes from has been really exciting for me.
I'm Dennis Robinson. I'm certainly not from the South, although I've lived there quite a bit of my life, lived here. But I have a new, she's 2 months old, granddaughter, my only granddaughter.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And one of the first things came to mind, although I don't know where I picked it up. I know my mom didn't teach me, but I've picked up cooking over the years, and I really like to do it, and I want to teach her how to cook from a grandfather's point of view.
That's a beautiful sentiment, and you can do it. I remember my very first job was, there's a picture of me where I'm barely one,
Right.
Sitting on the kitchen table, pulling apart bread to make breadcrumbs for something over Thanksgiving. You know, my mom said, pull this apart, because apparently I was a destructive child, so it was easy to give me something and expect it to be all crumbled up by the end. But putting kids in the kitchen is wonderful, and you tell her stories. You know, kitchens are the places where the stories come out, even when you don't mean to, when you're shucking corn or snapping green beans and doing those long labors. That's when you talk to each other. Are there any other questions, comments? I love hearing the family stories. This is my favorite part of the job.
Thank you for being here. My name is Nancy Lenhart. So I want to know, what is your favorite meal, and what would that look like?
Oh my gosh. Well, my favorite recipe, my favorite meal, so maybe classic, I will say, instead of boring. I love roasted chicken. I love roasted chicken. There's seldom anything that is more comforting and familiar and can sort of suit any occasion. So roasted chicken with lemons and onions, and I try and keep it pretty virtuous these days, so some kind of vegetables and salad, but I also make, and that's in the cookbook, and I also have a peanut chicken stew in the cookbook that is probably my favorite thing to cook from the cookbook. I make it all the time, people request it constantly, it's a whole meal. Again, peanut stews and soups are famous old school Southern food that we have forgotten about. I mean, Martha Washington was famous for her peanut stew that I'm sure a black woman made in her kitchen. You know what I mean? and so I love thinking about how to reconnect with the history. And so when I cook something like that, it sustains me emotionally as well. Thank you. Are there any other questions? Stories?
My name is Jo Gladdy, and I have dozens and dozens of cookbooks, not 1,000, but many of mine are quite old. I collect them for professional reasons as well, but historical ones, not so much family and literary. But since yours, you span a great time period as well in the 20th century, I wondered if you noticed what I've noticed, which is in recent decades, many recipes in our culture add a lot of sugar and butter that older recipes don't have so much of. And if you just cut those proportions to back what they used at the turn of the 20th century or in the last quarter of the 19th century, your apple-bound bready or cake or whatever it is tastes just as wonderful as a modern recipe, and it's much better for you and your family.
I have actually noticed that, and I think a part of it is the corruption of the palates, of our palates in the South of the century, you know, with all of the fake sugars and the corn syrups and the like hyper sweet things that we consume regularly that have dulled our senses. And then the question of the additional fats added, part of that too is skill. You know, like if you have to use a lot of grease if you don't know how to cook to make sure that things don't burn. I mean, and I think that that's something that's a really interesting balance. Like the more skillful you are, and the lower and slower you can cook it, the more helpful you can be as well. But I think that's a really interesting and important observation. Absolutely. Is anybody else?
Hi, my name is Iris Woods, and I come from a little town here in Arkansas called Cotton Plant. And just listening to your stories just brought back lots of memories for me. Rather than my mom or my grandmother teaching me how to cook, it was my father who had been taught by his mother. And she taught him how to cook everything from scratch. Growing up, my dad, he would raise what was called a truck patch garden. And so most of our foods was homegrown. And then he fished and he hunted. And so most of our things were, healthy. And he taught me, he took me in the kitchen at the age of 11 and started teaching me. And I mean, he even made breads from scratch and cakes and everything. And so by the time I was 13, he felt that, okay, now you're ready. And he sent me on my way, and it became my mission to every Sunday prepare the Sunday meal. And so now that I'm older and I have children and all my children have grown up, and we still get together on Sundays for Sunday meals. And as you said, that becomes a time when you get together and you share the stories and you talk about what happened when you grew up. And it's all based around food. And it just stirred me to hear you say that. So
it is. I'll say it forever. The intersection between storytelling and food fixing is deep. It's deep and moving and exciting. And I love, Southerners are the original, we're the farm-to-table originals, you know, like that truck patch garden, that is the original farm-to-table before the fancy fetishization of it in these restaurants, right? So I think going back to that, but also bearing in mind that, you know, farm-to-table, farms are not happy places for some people. Like when you think about the labor that one was asked to do on a farm that didn't even belong to you, if you think about whether or not you even feel safe in a country space, my great-grandmother, Dia, who's in the cookbook, she didn't cook either. Her husband, Papa, did all the cooking because he didn't want his black wife in a kitchen. He didn't want her associated with food getting, food fixing. It was too frightening for him. It was too emotionally taxing because he'd seen his mother's life in the kitchen, and it wasn't right to him. And his father was a white man who had taken advantage of a woman who worked in his house. And so thinking about farm to table can be hard, and so acknowledging that history is there so that then we can start to move past it and back into the kitchen is critical. But I think that there's a romance to the farm that we have in our more superficial discussions that I'm interested in breaking down a little bit so that we can get to the meat of what it really means and then go back in and do some real healing. Not to be too serious, the cornbread weekend. Are there any other questions?
Hi, my name is Linda, and my grandmother was a terrible cook, and my mother shooed me out of the kitchen, out of the way, so I don't have any of those good stories, but my grandfather, and this lady's story just reminded me of that. He had the garden, the family garden and everything, and he taught that everything should be so fresh that you put the water on to boil before you went out to pick the corn. And I never eat corn without seeing my grandfather's face. So I do have that memory of the attitude towards food and that it should be fresh.
That is really precious. I love that. I love that.
Hello, my name is Belinda, and I wanted to ask you, I'm collecting cookbooks to pass on to my daughters, but I find that the market is not out there for African American cookbooks. I can't find them. Did you notice that when you wrote your cookbook, or?
It's interesting. There's a lot of like one type of cookbook, which is everybody wants the, here's your fried chicken and candy jams and collard greens, and I mean there's a stereotype model that black and white consumers really buy into, but I think that's why two home cooks without a restaurant or culinary degree to their name were able to get a book deal and write a cookbook. It was me and my mother. As I think people are hungry for it, and the opportunities I've had to speak to people and to engage in these conversations over the course of the last year and a half tell me that there's a desired space there, and the books are starting to happen. It's new, but they are starting to happen because you're right, there is a desire for them and a paucity of them. Absolutely. Oh, but I will say one small treasure trove of black cookbooks that you should look into, women's club books. Because if you think about part of why my grandmothers were such great cooks is because the restaurants in Nashville were segregated until the late 60s, And so there would be all these lunch clubs, the Circlettes, the Links, the Irish, there were all of these clubs, and they would have lunch together at somebody's house multiple times a week, and so they cooked and they collected their recipes. So those black cookbooks, you can find them, people sell them on eBay. I don't know why they would sell them. I've got 2 shelves of just those things, but look for those in the meantime. Those are really precious.
This lady has a comment, but first I want to ask, do you have some of your books here that people can purchase today?
I believe they'll be downstairs, yes, in the gift shop. Yes.
I had just asked my husband about cooking from scratch,
Mm-hmm.
and the lady over here talked about it, and I wanted to ask, is that art still going on, and What, do you cook anything from scratch, and what is it?
Oh, I cook almost everything from scratch, which is part of why I cook very simply, because cooking from scratch can become very involved and wearisome and component. Which I bake up, that's not, meat and vegetables are not hard to cook from scratch. So I eat a lot of protein and a lot of vegetables, not because I'm on some weird diet, but because I like to eat clean. Now the other day I did bake an apple pie from scratch, and it took me like 5 hours. But I make everything from scratch. We have a crepe stack in our cookbook as an answer to a cake, also not just for the health purposes, but because making crepes takes about 1/8 of the time that baking a cake does. And then you make the layers, and it's really light and delicious, and you fill it with fruit. And again, that's my Louisiana roots coming out, but yeah. Okay, one more question, one more comment? Oh, over here.
My name is Marcia, and I was in relationship to the lady wanting to know about black cookbooks. Well, my mother-in-law was a great cook, but every time I would ask her about a recipe, she would tell me, I don't use recipes, I cook from mother's sense. And so that's what she would always tell me when I would push her on it. She said, a pinch of this, a pinch of that. And I go, I can't do that.
That vibration cooking, that's a great cookbook. The Verna Mae Grosvenor's Vibration Cooking is a brilliant cookbook, and that's what she calls it. She just feels the vibrations in the kitchen. But I think that, although you do start to get intuitive, when I was writing the cookbook, these are all my recipes, and I would be sort of tossing stuff and then go, oh no, and like take the pan and have to pour the olive oil back into the tablespoon to see how much I'd used. So kind of working backwards like that, but yeah, but it's you can learn the skill, but it is an admirable, and we all have those memories of that sort of vibration-y woman in the kitchen. It's wonderful. Thank you all so much. Thank you, thank you.